This is lecture 10 in the Western Peace tradition, and today I'll be looking at the Reformation Renaissance of the late 15th century, 16th century, and the whole issues of war and peace, how they work themselves out in that period of time as we move chronologically forward in this Western Peace tradition class. Before I do that, I'd like to just linger at a certain period of Middle Ages between two thinkers, which in many ways anticipate, but they stand on the shoulders of earlier ways of thinking, and then the implications of that for war and peace issues. The two thinkers I want to briefly discuss are Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the powerhouses of the first generation of the Cistercians, and Peter Abelard. Now, the two ways of thinking here, which are very, very important, is that Bernard of Clairvaux, for example, he comes from a background in which there is just one interpretation, or one dominant interpretation, in his case, as a Cistercian, as a Roman Catholic, of how the Bible is to be read, how the history of the West is to be read. And if a person deviates from that univocal or one-dimensional way of reading, somehow they are distorting, in his case, Christian history. And the Cistercians were part of a reviving renewal order within the Roman Catholic Church, and so he is the fiery leader of the Cistercian movement, articulated very clearly, and also back of him, because I mentioned Crusades last week, as abbot. Some of his earlier novices went on to play very prominent roles in the Roman Catholic Church, including one a pope who was one of the key figures in preaching the Crusades. So back of not only this way of interpreting reality in a simplistic black-white, right-wrong way of reality, there is also the translation of such a way of looking at reality into the world of action, because ideas and actions and reality, the holding together and the making sense of those are foundational to war. Peace. It's one thing to think about peace, but it's how is it brought about, and what's the relationship of thinking and willing and thinking and action and thinking. So Bernard, for example, he argued very clearly that there was an emerging Muslim threat, that Christians had to muster their Rohirrim and be part of restoring Christendom to its greatness, and particularly Crusades in Jerusalem and the Holy Land and all of this. But his epistemology, or his way of thinking, was reducing the interpretation of Western civilization to a one-dimensional manner, and then out of that comes the world of action. So this is who we are. We must revive our great Western tradition. There are, as it were, people corrupting it from within, and there are attacks from without, as it were the Muslims in this case. So we have to deal with the heretics, so they're heterodox within, and we have to deal with the threats to the West. Sound similar? We face that similar way of dealing with things today. His opponent was Peter Abelard, one of the most sophisticated philosophers of the time. And Abelard argued that, in fact, when we reflect on history, when we reflect on philosophers and theology and exegetes and politics and economics and culture and literature, all of these things, what we have is a polyphonic heritage. Polyphonic from Greek just meaning poly, many, phonic, voice. But there are many voices in dialogue, dialogos, through thinking and being open to hear the truth as much as anyone can understand. But we need collegially to come together, because people see things, they hear things differently, and it says many people come together, people learn from one another, and there's not a univocal tradition or a uniphonic in that sense. It's polyphonic. And so in Peter Abelard you get the notion that there are a multiplicity of ways within a broad framework. So it's not that there's no framework whatsoever, but it's a broad framework of finite, fallible people heeding the wisdom of the past, the many voices of the past, and then moving forward. So standing on the shoulders of giants who have gone before in that sense. So these two ways of knowing, the Bernardian way of a uniphonic or a univocal way of interpreting, and then how that way of looking at reality justifies acting to purge the heretics within, and in a military, crusading, inquisitional way, go after in this case, the Muslims in Jerusalem. The Abelardian way is a much more irenical way. So here you have two traditions: the irenical Abelardian tradition, based on the fact we all see through a dark glass darkly. We are all limited. We need the wisdom of other women and men. They're thinking throughout history, and then they're thinking in the present tense to move forward. So it's an irenical epistemology versus, in many ways, a hawkish epistemology. And so we can see these two thinkers, the Bernardian and the Abelardian, as embodying ways of seeing that then lead to action and consequences. One war, one crusade, one inquisitions, the other being wary of heading down such a track. Now, as we move towards the 16th century, then, of course, what happens is the same drama plays itself out, just the next act in the drama of Western history when it comes to war and peace. This time the clash comes between Martin Luther and Erasmus. Luther argued very clearly, succinctly, as he moved through his life in his 20s and 30s, that the Roman Catholic Church was corrupt. The Roman Catholic Church could never be reformed, after a variety of times in which he tried to do this. And that so Luther moves in the direction of I and I alone know what genuine Christianity is. I and I alone know how to interpret the Bible. I and I alone, in terms of engaging the Western tradition, Augustine, or the Bible, Romans, Galatians, and others. And I alone are applying that to reform the church, which can't be reformed, so hence I have to begin another form of Christianity, in his case Lutheranism. And so this is again a confrontational approach, which initially begins in terms of black-white ways of knowing, reducing reality to simplistic formulas or cliches, and then acting on those. So again, will and thought and will come together. The alternate to Martin Luther, of course Calvin will move further down that road, and then the questions becomes whose version of interpreting the Bible. The Anabaptist Mennonites will do the same thing. Baptists, Quakers will finally, it's just my heart is the sacred text. So eventually you get down, everybody in different ways tends to see their reads as right, and those who differ with them as not of the same level of integrity or insight or wisdom. And so in many ways the pluralism and fragmentation that we see today in a more secular context was very much birthed in the 16th century. And Luther and Calvin, Anabaptists, Baptists, Quakers, all these different groups, all claiming that their interpretation of reality or of a text is right, and then fragmenting in terms of their direction with that. So rather than unity or concord, what happens with this certain approach to knowing, which is each person is right in the sight of their own eyes, and then they act on that rightness, which leads to very different, in this case, 16th century denominations. But you just secularize that. That's just where we are today. You drop off the religious element. It's just the sheer fragmentation of our culture, which then inevitably what happens is when you get fragmentation, then often what happens is people are longing for some sort of solid truth, some firm ground to stand on, and then often there's the longing for some answer which itself distorts reality, which Bernard was doing with Abelard, or what Luther does. And so, but Luther's main opponent was Erasmus. Erasmus, like Abelard, argued that in reflecting on the fullness of the Western tradition, of which you had classical literature, Plato, Aristotle, the complex nature of the Greek and Roman tradition, the biblical tradition, Christian tradition, the synthesis of all that, is that you can't reduce an interpretation of a complex reality. It's polyphonic. there's many voices at work, which doesn't mean anything goes. It means there's an elastic framework within the house, as it were, of the Western tradition. There's many rooms. It is a house, and so there are things that define it as a house, but there's multiple rooms and hallways and passages and turrets and high levels and basements, and there's much to it. And so to reduce it to a simple room is to distort and to shrink the house. Now, of course, with Erasmus, drawing from an Abelardian tradition, it's an irenical tradition. It's an attempt to be peacemakers. And Erasmus also, in terms of the clash between the Renaissance tradition, let's get back to the classics, the best of the Greco-Roman tradition. Erasmus was one of the great Christian humanists who said, okay, there's a richness in the classical Greek and Roman tradition. There's a richness in the biblical tradition. There's a richness in the early Christian tradition. There's a richness in the medieval. How do we bring this mother lode, this gold mine, together as we move into the future without dimming or shrinking it? Now, what happened in Luther, to some degree, the Renaissance became the problem and the Reformation was the answer, just as Lutheranism was the answer and the Catholic Church was the problem. So this simple dualism, a simple black and white, almost comic book view of reality comes to dominate. And so within these two models of the Western tradition, in the 16th century, you get the Erasminian at an intellectual level, irenical. So what's the good? In the Renaissance tradition, the rebirth of the classical tradition, as I mentioned, of Greco-Roman thought, and what's the good in returning to the Bible and its complex richness and fullness and multiple ways of interpreting the text. So not only is there peacemaking going on at the level of modeling and trying to make sense of life, rather than simply saying, as Luther, Catholic Church is corrupt, Lutheranism is right, Reformation is right, Renaissance is the problem. This way of thinking then leads to, as it were, discord, fragmentation, things falling apart. The other leads to concord, harmony. And so these two ways of thinking are very much a war-peace model. Not only in one is synthesizing, the other is dividing ideas, but then they lead, in this case, when it comes to the will, Germany increasingly becomes, increasingly what spins out of this is the rise of nation states, finally the religious wars of the 16th, 17th centuries, the Westphalian tradition that emerges from that tries to some way mute what religion can do because of the religious wars, versus the irenical tradition of an Abelardian Erasmus, which Erasmus points the way to Hugo Grotius, one of the great thinkers that birthed international law. Out of these become institutions we know today, initially in the 20th century League of Nations, then United Nations, but thinking internationally beyond just nation-state ethnic interests, but looking at how can peaceful resolutions come to be at the world of thought, which is important because people can differ on the level of thought, and the way they deal with the fragmentation and the clashes is they just separate. So it's sort of benign way of dealing with differences. Worst case scenario, of course, people begin to act in a militaristic way in the name of they being right, others being wrong, and then the violence and wars that come from that. But underneath it, it comes from a way of looking at reality that sees life as more complex, the Abelardian Erasminian tradition, or the dovish, or the soft left owlish, or there's the Bernardian Lutheran tradition, which leads in certain directions. Michael Massing's book that came out a couple of years ago called Fatal Discord, and he looks at how in the 16th century the clashes between Luther and Erasmus were a fatal discord that not only fragmented the West and essentially destroyed the West as it had been known, but that way of thinking continues in our day, and we can certainly see it played out in culture wars and people dismissing others, rhetorically turning cannons on them. in which there is no listening, there is no attempt to reconcile, there is no irenical attitude, and then how, as a result of that, the consequences are there for all to see. There's the enemy, there's the good, there's the right, there's the wrong. That's just Luther, straight out of Luther. That's just Bernardian Gnosticism in that sense, versus the Abelardian, Erasmian, irenical peacemaking tradition. And so this fatal discord, these two paths taken following the Bernardian Luther, they take a person in a direction of discord, fragmentation, people separated into little tribes and clans, and then worst case, obviously war, blaming others for injustice or problems, versus the irenical, the attempt to heal. And so these two traditions, when we come into the modern world on the war-peace issue, two paths can be taken and two consequences lived with as those paths are taken. And the Abelardian, Erasmian goes in one direction, the Bernardian, Lutheran goes in another. I'd like to finish with, again, as I continue with the Pauline Johnson's Legends of Vancouver. The one we'll look at today is the one in which the story goes of Pauline Johnson again, and this story is told more, it seems to be from a Haida context, is the story of it's a split rock in that sense. And so Pauline is on a trip up north in a boat with, again, an elder. And they reach this point, and there's this rock which is obviously split. And how did it become that way? And Pauline Johnson asks how this rock becomes split the way it was, because it's a very unusual landmark on the water, and it's off a shoreline. And so the elder says, "Let me tell you a story." Interesting enough, I might just linger here for a second, when First Nations are telling stories from a person who just sees empirical history as the only way of understanding facts, information. First Nations are less interested in what can be denied, confirmed through empirical analysis, as there are legends, there are stories, and there are markings which confirm or deny those things, which cannot be verified or falsified in a certain way that a certain type of Western historians deal with history. And this is what often creates conflicts between Western empirical views of dates, names, facts, history, events, and then another approach which is more mythical or legendary, which doesn't quite fit within that one-dimensional methodology. And so, of course, as we're moving forward, in terms of acknowledging or recognizing First Nations' approach to history, this becomes an ongoing tension between people trained in a certain approach to doing history and another approach entirely which does not come from that particular hard facts, events, dates that can be verified, falsified, places, to landmarks that stories are told, which have a very different way of understanding their message and their meaning. So to move back to the story then, so there's this young woman who's emerging. She's her mother is keen at a certain point, as is she, to get married. And the question is, who will she marry? She's an very attractive woman. She's entering that phase of her life where relationship, marriage, she's wanting to move forward in. And there are two suitors who come along. One is a medicine man, older, but also deeply bitter inside, angry, and he hasn't dealt with his demons in any way. But people fear him because of his power as a medicine man. He can do things, and if people dare to question him, he will cast spells on them, and they will suffer from diseases and illnesses. He's nearing the end of his journey, but he still has these immense powers as a medicine man. But his internal soul is toxic. It's rotten. It's not right. But he wants this young woman. He wants to marry her. On the other hand, there's a young brave who comes along, obviously not having the years of experience of this medicine man. And so there's a contest. So the young woman, her mother come along and say, whoever can throw this stone the furthest, I will say, yes, he is going to be my husband. So the medicine man, with his spell, he conjures up magic and he throws an immense stone across the water. Even though physically he's not strong anymore, he has the powers of magic. He throws a stone, and the stone cuts through this rock out in the middle on the far side of the shore and splits the rock in two, cuts through it and continues along the water. So the stone continues moving, and obviously the young brave, who has no magical powers, no skills in that way, can't do that. So he lacks the power, but the young brave has the wisdom and the potential of a future good chief. The other has the power but not the wisdom, and as I mentioned, his heart and soul have become dark. There's poisons in his soul, but he has power. And so between the one who is powerful but lacks wisdom and is corrupt inside, and the other one who lacks power but seems to have immense future as a good person who can mature as a meaningful chief. So he tries, the young man, he gets his stone about to throw it. He throws it, but then the medicine man casts a spell on the stone, and the stone goes up and turns back, and the stone then comes down on the mother and kills her. And so, of course, this was not the intention of the medicine man, but this is what happened. And of course, everyone in the band or the tribe are shocked by what's happened. And obviously, the young woman takes the position. She sees what this medicine man has done, as has other members in the band, and essentially they just reject him as a medicine man, realizing that his spells and his abilities are very much distorted by a character that has gone sour, gone rotten inside. He's a bitter, angry person who the slings and arrows of life have done things to him, and he has not made sense of those in a meaningful way. Now the young woman, when she sees her mother's death, she's obviously terribly distraught, for she loved her mother deeply, and she runs to the cliff. And the young man, recognizing she's going to throw herself over the cliff out of sadness of what has happened to her mother, he grabs her, and the two of them go over the cliff together and both drown. Now, as the story is being told, Pauline Johnson is coming up the river to this rock, and all of a sudden they see two silver fish swimming close together, very close together, alongside of the boat near this rock. And the message is that the young woman and man, even though they died, they now continue to live together peacefully, as they are ever in search of the mother who died as a result of the evil chief. Significant to note in this story, of course, this is once again pre-contact. These are Pauline Johnson hearing stories from the hider, Chief Joe Capilano, that regardless of where a person comes from historically, human nature can go in diverse directions. Based on suffering and struggles, people can become, as a result of unfortunate things coming their way in life, they can become angry and bitter. And if they have power, whether in this case a medicine man or power in politics, they can do, out of their own pain, they can do hurtful things to others. The other option, and so this is very much the angry warrior, the hawkish type, and the other, you get the young man and woman, much more ironical. They come together, and as a result are willing to die rather than become angry themselves like the medicine man. They are gifted as becoming a silver fish that constantly swim around that rock, ever in search of the mother, but united for the rest of their life as one, even though not as people, but as these beautiful silver fish that swim along the boat. And of course the boat is the symbol of those who know how to sail across the water of time without being drowned by it. And so this fine little legend of Vancouver about the split rock is once more a story, Pauline Johnson in this case heeding the Haida story of where a certain level of undealt with internal evil can take a person, and yet where there is peaceful unity and people willing to die for goodness, what they become in their next morphing of life of silver fish that are together, accompanying the bigger ship of which Pauline Johnson was on with the elder, guiding them round the rocks that could lead to their own destruction.